Welcome, everybody. This is an event co-sponsored by the Yale Global Justice Program and the Poynter Program at Yale University. And we are very happy to have with us today Sana Sbouaï, who is a Poynter Fellow for this academic year 2021-2022. Sana is an investigative journalist whose work focuses on North Africa since the time of the 2011 revolutions that inaugurated the Arab Spring. Since that time, she has spent most of her time in Tunisia and continues to visit the country regularly for work. She has covered all the different electoral events that have marked the democratic transition. And previously, she has been a student of law, political science, journalism, and sociology. I will turn it over to her, and we will have some interventions in French, for which you can choose the translation below either the English channel, or if you want to listen to the original, you can switch to the French channel. Sana, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today with friends and colleagues, especially that our intervention today takes place in a very particular context in Tunisia. We're gonna speak about how journalists can cover elections in Tunisia, where there's little accountability, and how we managed to try to do so between 2009 and 2022, let's say. But last July, the ruling president suspended the parliament in Tunisia. And yesterday, he took a further step in the seizure of the power by declaring the dissolution of the parliament. The members of the parliament had met virtually to vote to cancel the special measures taken by the president. The question of the accountability is there crucial for us. And I'm really happy that my colleague Lilia Blaise can join us, because Zoom seems to have not been working really well in Tunisia lately. So I hope that the connection will last, as she's not a parliament member, and that her freedom of speech can still be working. So the whole question is, how can journalists show the reality on the ground when data, knowledge, and accountability are lacking in Tunisia? Following the revolution in Tunisia in 2011, several electoral events took place. We will focus today on the legislative and presidential elections between 2011 and 2019. To do so, on one hand, you have two journalists, so Lilia Blaise, journalist covering Tunisia since 2011. She's working today for Le Monde, the French newspaper, Mediapart, Investigative, French website, France 24. Myself, we will talk about the difficulties of the media coverage, the lack of sociology of voting, the lack of data on the country, the difficulties to learn about the profiles of the candidates. And on another hand, we are lucky that we have with us Mr. Kamel Jendoubi, thanks to whom free, independent, and transparent elections could take place in Tunisia in 2011, as he is the former president of the Independent High Authority for Elections that was set up just after the revolution. Mr. Jendoubi just released a book, La Tunisie votes, Tunisia is voting, Tunisia votes, where he speaks about his own experience. But before we go further into the dialogue, let me just give you some context about Tunisia. So from December 2010, following the immolation of a street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, in the inland town of Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia was crossed by a popular movement of protest. And this led on January 14, 2011, to the escape of the dictator who was in place since 23 years, Zindine Ben Ali, sorry. 2 decades ago, Ben Ali had organized a coup against the first Tunisian president. That first president was the actor of the country's independence, Habib Bourguiba. And Habib Bourguiba himself remained in power for 30 years, which means that in 2011, Tunisians had only known 2 presidents for more than 15 years. So you have the revolution in January 2011. And then in October 2011, we have the first election of a constituent assembly in charge of writing a new constitution. In 2014, we have the first presidential and legislative elections in accordance with the framework that was set up by the newly written constitution. In 2018, we get the first municipal election since the revolution. Finally, in 2019, we elected, the president who was elected at that time died a few months before the end of his term, and presidential and legislative elections are held always in accordance with the constitution. So until then, everything was fine. And then last July, after more than a year of disagreement on the political scene, after permanent quarrel within the assembly, the president newly elected, Kais Saied, struck a blow to the democratic transition process. He used an article of the new constitution, froze the activity of the parliament, and took over all the power. So Tunisia is now experiencing a new coup. And so, as I said, yesterday, the president took another step and dissolved the assembly, which, according to me, is a new step toward an authoritarian regime. That's why accountability and media coverage really matters. But to give you even more context about what happened in 2011 and how elections could take place, I'm going to now give the floor to Mr. Kamel Jendoubi, who's going to tell us about his own experience.
Merci de m'avoir invité à cette rencontre. Bon, on m'a demandé donc de plutôt présenter une contribution relative à la première expérience des élections en Tunisie en 2011. Et peut-être dans les échanges, on peut revenir sur l'actualité et le sens des événements qui s'accélèrent dans ce petit pays qui a marqué un peu l'histoire en 2011 et qui continue à intéresser beaucoup de personnes, pas simplement à l'intérieur, mais aussi à l'extérieur. Tout d'abord, je voudrais commencer par dire quelques mots sur mon parcours personnel qui ne me prédisposait pas à diriger un jour une instance électorale pour relever un défi. C'est vraiment un défi, celui d'organiser les premières élections libres de l'histoire du pays. Je ne sais pas si la traduction, ça va pour vous, parce que Alors, de formation scientifique, j'ai surtout eu des engagements associatifs dans l'immigration en France, où je réside depuis des années, puis dans le champ de la défense des droits humains. Ma deuxième remarque concerne l'élection libre. On peut dire que toutes les élections qu'a connues la Tunisie depuis son indépendance en 1956 ne répondent pas aux conditions minimales permettant de les qualifier de libres, transparentes, pluralistes, etc. Pourquoi alors, en 2011, il y a eu le choix des élections pour une assemblée constituante, la seconde de l'histoire du pays depuis l'indépendance? Parce que si les premières, en 1956, avaient pour finalité de passer du régime bellical, c'est-à-dire royal, à la République, à un régime républicain, les secondes de 2011 avaient pour objectif de rompre avec un régime totalitaire qui a régné plus d'un demi-siècle en cherchant à instaurer une république dotée d'un régime démocratique, d'où d'ailleurs le surnom de Deuxième République. Ce qui était recherché donc est la rupture avec le régime totalitaire, rupture qui se voulait profonde et radicale en sapant les bases juridiques et institutionnelles sur lesquelles il était assis. Il y a toute une histoire entre la Constitution et les Tunisiens. On peut même dire qu'il y a une passion tunisienne qui s'est exprimée d'abord au XIXe siècle, depuis d'ailleurs l'octroi par le bey, le roi à l'époque, le 10 septembre 1957, d'une constitution, enfin d'abord d'un pacte fondamental, d'une charte, si vous voulez, des droits, et puis d'une constitution. Et souvent en Tunisie, peut-être aussi valable dans d'autres pays, on prête à chaque texte constitutionnel, à chaque changement de constitution, des vertus de réforme selon l'époque. D'ailleurs, le réformisme tunisien est indissociable de la question de la constitution. Pour ne citer qu'un exemple, le parti d'historiens, c'est-à-dire constitutionnel, qui a dominé la vie politique aussi bien lors de l'indépendance, de la lutte pour l'indépendance, qui a régné au pays jusqu'en 2011, a toujours utilisé le qualificatif constitutionnel dans sa dénomination, qui a changé à plusieurs reprises. Cependant, quand on s'est posé la question de la constituante en 2011, peut-être qu'on ne s'est pas posé une autre question importante. À quoi sert une constitution? Et à quoi servent les élections si elles ne permettent pas de changer la vie des gens dans toutes ses dimensions, politiques, sociales, économiques, culturelles, environnementales, etc. Et c'est sur cela qu'on bute jusqu'à nos jours. Je voudrais maintenant aborder brièvement, même si Sana l'a rappelé, le contexte dans lequel se sont déroulées les élections de 2011. D'abord, la chute du dictateur Zine Abidine Ben Ali, après un règne personnel de plus de 23 ans, marqué par le népotisme, le despotisme et la corruption. Ce caractère totalitaire qui a impacté toutes les dimensions de la vie publique en Tunisie se basait sur deux piliers importants. La police, pas seulement en tant qu'instrument de répression, mais en tant qu'État-pouvoir, car l'État, à l'époque de Ben Ali, se résumait essentiellement à un État policier. Puis, le parti unique, le Rassemblement constitutionnel démocratique, qui régnait. L'administration à l'époque, et jusqu'à 2011, était soumise à ces deux pouvoirs. Évidemment, les citoyens ont perdu confiance en l'État et en réalité, ils ne cherchaient qu'à se protéger contre les exactions de cet État. La peur était réellement palpable partout en Tunisie. Une autre remarque concernant l'armée. L'armée a été perçue, au lendemain d'ailleurs de 2011, comme un acteur protecteur, rassurant, même si les interrogations demeurent quant au véritable rôle qu'elle a joué, notamment dans les événements de 1978, la première grève générale en Tunisie, où l'armée a tiré sur la foule, ou encore en 1984, où elle a aussi une deuxième fois tiré sur la foule pacifique, et même en 2010-2011, quand il y a eu des affrontements, et l'armée aussi a tiré sur la foule en 2010-2011. Il ne reste pas moins que l'armée se considère comme républicaine et, comme on l'appelle souvent muette, elle le demeure muette, tout en servant les pouvoirs en place et l'ordre républicain. Face à ce contexte réellement inattendu, car personne ne s'attendait à cette situation-là et à ce changement énorme que la Tunisie a connu entre le 17 décembre 2010 et le 14 janvier 2011, l'idée était, enfin, en tout cas, face à ce contexte, nous avons tous dû apprendre en faisant. On n'était pas préparé, donc il fallait faire avec ce qu'on a et essayer d'apprendre au plus vite. S'agissant des élections, l'idée d'une instance électorale indépendante, en fait, est une revendication portée par l'opposition depuis les années 2000. Elle était mieux formulée en 2007. Indépendance par rapport à qui? Indépendance par rapport au gouvernement et surtout par rapport au ministère de l'Intérieur qui, avec le parti unique, le RCD, ont supervisé tous les deux d'organiser toutes les élections, imputant des scores ridicules aux vainqueurs de plus de 90% des voix. Mais très rapidement, cette nouvelle instance qui s'appelle l'instance supérieure indépendante pour les élections s'est trouvée confrontée à plusieurs défis à relever dans un laps de temps réduit de 5 mois, du 17 mai 2011, où elle a été nommée par une autre instance qui s'appelle la haute instance pour aller vite pour la réforme politique, jusqu'au 23 octobre 2011. Quels sont ces défis? Elle partait de rien, de zéro. Il faut d'abord s'installer physiquement, avoir des locaux, Il faut encore s'organiser régionalement, avoir des démembrements. L'ISI au niveau national doit se démembrer dans toutes les circonscriptions, sur tous les territoires. Il faut encore réglementer, parce que les règlements passés sont obsolètes, pour ne pas dire antidémocratiques. Il faut recruter le personnel, administration, agents d'inscription, membres des bureaux de vote. Il faut aussi gérer les conflits internes, car l'ISI se composait à la fois d'une commission centrale composée de 16 membres et de commissions régionales composées de 364 membres. L'ISI, en réalité, se composait de plus de 370 membres. Et il fallait donc aussi gérer tous ces conflits qui apparaissaient normaux entre des gens qui ne se connaissaient pas avant et qui se sont mis à travailler ensemble pour réaliser les élections. Il faut aussi établir de nouveaux rapports avec le gouvernement, avec comme objectif préserver l'indépendance de l'ISI. Il faut encore établir de nouveaux rapports avec les partis politiques et les associations qui ont été donc, à qui on a permis, qui ont été créés très rapidement. Il faut communiquer, il faut coopérer avec les partenaires internationaux. Tout cela, il fallait le mener aussi tout en menant le processus électoral en même temps, selon un calendrier, à commencer par la campagne d'inscription sur les listes électorales, car, aussi paradoxal que cela puisse paraître, nous n'avons pas de registre électoral fiable en Tunisie, en dépit du fait qu'il y a eu des élections de 1956 à 2011. Comme nous avons aussi un code électoral, mais un code électoral qui est fait en réalité pour l'apparence, pour les apparences. Il fallait donc inscrire les gens, il fallait faire un registre électoral fiable. Il fallait aussi gérer les candidatures. Nous avons eu plus de 10 000 candidatures à cette époque. Le mode de scrutin, un petit mot, c'est un mode de scrutin qui cherche à faire participer le maximum des familles politiques et idéologiques pour participer à la rédaction d'une nouvelle constitution. Donc, c'est la proportionnelle intégrale au plus fort reste. On peut y revenir. C'est un mode de scrutin qui nous a à la fois résolu un problème, mais nous a créé d'autres. Il faut aussi mener la campagne électorale. C'est une nouvelle campagne électorale où il y a une relative liberté. Il faut contrôler le financement de la campagne électorale, assurer et contrôler. C'est quelque chose de nouveau pour nous. Aussi organiser le jour des élections, qui était un jour de fête, à mon avis, proclamer les résultats, etc., et le contentieux électoral. Donc tout cela dans un laps de temps très, très réduit. Et il faut dire que c'était vraiment un défi que nous avons relevé avec l'aide de tous les acteurs, et pas seulement l'instance électorale seule. Alors comment on a essayé d'être transparent et de rendre des comptes? C'était la demande qui a été faite à cette intervention. L'idée de la redevabilité. D'abord, rappelons que l'idée de l'ISI, à l'époque, le mandat de l'ISI, était limité dans le temps par la loi, jusqu'à la proclamation des résultats. Parce qu'on était toujours dans une logique de provisoire. Le provisoire qui dure, d'ailleurs. L'état d'exception aujourd'hui est considéré comme provisoire, mais elle dure et elle se prolonge. La loi, à l'époque, nous imposait, c'est un décret-loi en réalité, de présenter un rapport et de permettre le contrôle ex post de la Cour des comptes. On était soumis donc au contrôle de la Cour des comptes. Les principales décisions que nous avons prises ont été publiées, communiquées aux partis, aux médias et au public via notre site, car nous avons aussi été amenés à créer un site, ou encore les conférences de presse. Elles sont nombreuses et elles sont aussi très suivies. Nous avons aussi, usant de notre pouvoir réglementaire, mis à mettre des règlements touchant des différentes étapes du processus électoral. Même dans la mise en place du règlement, la consultation a été la règle, même si parfois, souvent d'ailleurs, le temps nous a manqué. Je donne quelques exemples. Manuel des règles et procédures relatives au financement de la campagne électorale. Ça, c'était fait en concertation avec la Cour des comptes, le ministère des Finances, le Conseil de l'ordre des experts comptables et en discussion avec les partis et les associations. Un autre exemple, les médias. D'abord, un petit mot, le contexte de l'époque. D'abord, un vide juridique, car le Code de la presse de 1975 a été abrogé, mais aussi un vide institutionnel, car le ministère de la Communication a été supprimé. Seul existait une instance nationale d'information et de communication qu'on appelle INRIC, qui n'est pas une instance de régulation, qui est une instance consultative chargée spécialement par le gouvernement à l'époque, nommée d'ailleurs par le gouvernement, de proposer des réformes dans le secteur des médias. Et elle a fait un rapport que je trouve un rapport très important, malheureusement, qui n'a pas été suffisamment et utilement utilisé pour faire les réformes nécessaires dans les médias. D'ailleurs, les médias n'ont pas été réformés depuis. Donc, il n'y a pas de réforme de médias. Alors, pour essayer de combler ce vide institutionnel et juridique, nous avons associé l'INRIC, cette instance consultative, à nos travaux. Et nous avons aussi associé le syndicat national des journalistes tunisiens, ce qui a donné plusieurs choses, notamment une unité de monitoring des médias qui a été dirigée par un journaliste, Hamid Albo. Un autre exemple, la campagne électorale a été l'objet de rencontres et d'échanges avec les médias, les partis et les associations. La mobilisation des médias publics, notamment par l'attribution par tirage au sort d'un temps égal d'enregistrement, télévision et radio, pour plus de 1500 listes en compétition. De même pour les radios publiques. Le contrôle de la campagne électorale, outre l'unité de monitoring qui a été créée en associant l'INRIC et le syndicat des journalistes, en fait, nous avons eu un autre mécanisme avec un organisme suisse qui s'appelle DECAF, et puis une fondation ICT for Peace, qui a consisté à créer une application, un SMS, utilisée par les contrôleurs de l'ISI. Il y avait à peu près 1 millier de contrôleurs sur le terrain. Encore deux autres exemples, et je termine sur les exemples qui nous ont permis d'essayer de travailler dans la transparence et dans la transparence notamment pour les médias, c'est en matière d'achat, par exemple. L'ISI n'était pas soumise aux obligations du Code des marchés publics, du fait des délais courts de sa mission. Il ne reste pas moins, et dans tous les achats que nous avons faits, nous avons donc mis en œuvre les principes de faire jouer la concurrence. Par exemple, les marchés de l'identité visuelle de l'instance, du site web, du logo et de l'organisation d'une campagne de sensibilisation et d'éducation, spots, dépliants, flyers, panneaux, etc., a été le fruit d'une série de rencontres, de présentations impliquant la plupart des agences exerçant en Tunisie. Le centre média qui a fonctionné pendant pratiquement 2 semaines est aussi le fruit d'une coopération avec le programme des Nations Unies pour le développement. Ces activités, notamment pendant l'annonce des résultats, ont été transmises en direct sur les médias sociaux, mais aussi sur les médias nationaux et internationaux pour celles qui veulent transmettre en direct ces travaux. Enfin, le financement de l'instance, qui provient uniquement du budget de l'État, a fait l'objet d'une communication régulière, en particulier quand on reçoit des versements, des tranches successives. On annonce le versement de ces tranches par voie de presse et par voie de site. Voilà comment on a essayé à l'époque, donc il y a déjà 11 ans, essayer d'être le plus transparent possible et de respecter un peu les méthodes dans les mesures du possible, car nous avons aussi commis des erreurs, il y a eu des manquements aussi sur lesquels on peut revenir, mais pour l'essentiel, l'esprit dans lequel on a travaillé pour réaliser ces élections de 2011 était vraiment celui de l'ouverture et la transparence. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jendoubi, for that first presentation that allows us to try to understand what was Tunisia before and after January 2011. I will try now to share with you my own experience as a young journalist, and then for a decade, I tried to cover the election in Tunisia. Il n'y a pas de traduction?
Oui, mais je comprends un peu l'anglais, hein, donc c'est bon.
So I will go on. I can say that there is several ideas in my own experience. At the beginning, we had to do the media coverage without having information about the past. Then, as we were moving on, without being able to get information about the present. And as time passed by, we try to accumulate data and understand trends to talk about the future. So in 2011, I want to say welcome in a new world. I found myself in Tunisia covering the democratical transition without realizing it. So to take the words of Mr. Jendoubi, we were not expecting that. In March 2011, I arrived in an unknown territory. My family is not from Tunis. And I arrived in Tunis to spend a few months learning Arabic. You have to imagine Tunis in the spring 2011. The main avenue was an open-air agora where people will gather and meet to talk to each other, standing in the streets. There was demonstrations. There was the police that continued to use violence against the demonstrators. There was a curfew in the capital, but there was also an effervescence in the country. The citizens had demands, they had claims, and they expressed them for the first time. And political discussions were going on to decide what to do with the revolution. At this time, I was only there as a binational, curious to understand what was happening in the country. I was reading all the information that I could find in the French-speaking media and on social network, which mainly was Facebook at the time. And it was a great place for freedom of expression, where people were able to connect with each other, to report on the state of the country, and coordinated to organize actions. But the difference between what I was reading in a French-speaking newspaper and what I was perceiving from the field and the concern of my relative, the difference was really big. It's at that time that I met Lilia Blaise, and a few weeks later, we decided to move, to find a flat and to work together to start covering Tunisian news. And at first, we did it for a blog from Slate Afrique, and the blog was called Tawa fi Tunis, now in Tunis, now in Tunisia. And days and nights, we were following the news and working quite in a messy way, to be honest, but, you know, living the whole Tunisian effervescence about the whole transition. From the point of view of journalistic practice, there is a methodology when you cover elections, beyond the codes of conduct, beyond impartiality, beyond legal aspects. The coverage follows the temporal sequences, the candidates in the making, the candidacy, the programs, the state of the country, the electoral campaign, the sociology of the voters, the vote, the counting, the results, the frauds, but how to cover it without a past? Because in 2011, there was no point of comparison. In 2011, it was difficult to know what Tunisia was. This was reflected in the testimonies of citizens, especially on social media and in the streets. And it was far away from the postcard image that was sold by the dictator at the time. One small example that I would like to take is to look at the figures of the elections, because it allows us to understand the distortion of the reality. In 2011, just after the revolution, more than 8 million voters were registered on the electoral list. There were only 5 million during Ben Ali time. In 2011, we had 4 million of people voting, which ended up with a participation of 51%. In 2009, for the last presidential and legislative election under Ben Ali, according to the authorities, so 5 million of citizens were registered, 4 million of them voted, and we ended up with a participation of 89% and a result of 89% for Ben Ali, which shows us that as there was no accountability during the time of Ben Ali under the dictatorship, it seems impossible to know what were the data. But beyond the authoritarian situation and the police state, this figure shows us that in 2011, it was really difficult for us as journalists to rely on the past to try to tell about the present situation. And we couldn't go back and ask to the former authorities to tell us about the past and explain why there was such a gap in the figures. Another question was how to cover without information. In 2011, there were too many candidates, too many political parties, because there was a thirst for democracy and participation. But there was too little information, as many candidates, many political parties were new and others were banned under Ben Ali. So we decided to go for a media coverage on what was within our reach, small reports from the field, and we focused on what people were experiencing, because the claims for freedom, equality, dignity of the citizen were a crucial point. And they were screaming in our face that we didn't have any idea about what Tunisia was really like. And because we didn't have info on the candidates, but neither on the citizen and neither on the state of the country, doing small reports on the ground was an easier way to try to stick to the reality. As journalist, I was in a double position. I'm a stakeholder of the implementation of this democratical transition, but also a direct beneficiary of this transition, because I am Tunisian. And it's not simply a matter of covering the historical news of the country, of the region. It's being directly affected by it. So I was trying to rebalance a balance that has an immediate impact on my own life. Then comes 2014 and the first legislative and presidential election. And at that time, I was working for a Tunisian website that we co-founded. It was the first time that those elections were happening according to the new constitution. The idea for us was to accompany the process of the continuity. In a few years, political parties have emerged, political leaders have been elected, debates have been taking place within the Constituent Assembly, sometimes with some conflicts. The Assembly was supposed to write the Constitution in 1 year, but they ended up taking 2.5 years, and a sit-in for weeks was needed for the parliamentary members to finish to write the Constitution and move out. During this year, between 2011 and 2014, during those years of writing the Constitution, there were habits of communication established between the parliament members, politicians, journalists, citizens, which made the work of media coverage easier. One could finally find out what was going on the arcane of the power. One could ask for interviews and accounts, even if not all ministers complied in the same way. But the dialogue was established, and it helped to put in place at least the idea of accountability, if not completely establish it. If the right of access to information is well stipulated in the Tunisian Constitution of 2014, it's only in 2016 that a law was voted to implement the access and frame it. Even though today you still have the right to request information, but it seems that there is still no real obligation to get the information transmitted to you as a journalist. Now, let me allow you to tell you about the elections of 2019 and how they showed me that accountability is not yet a real implemented concept in Tunisia. In the summer of 2019, the ruling president passed away, leading to early elections. At that time, I was working for a Tunisian media that was a project from a research association. The approach was different, and the short experience accumulated since 2011 allows us to better understand the expectation of the citizen, to understand the situation of the several regions of Tunisia, the whole social economical problems, the fatigue and disappointment of some voters, but the still strong enthusiasm of some other people. A past, even short, has been accumulated and allowed us to look differently at these elections, understand why the profile of two completely opposite candidates are found in the second run of the presidential election. On one hand, a media businessman, and on the other hand, an austere law teacher, profiles that the Western media have difficulty to understand. There will be for them a liberal candidate who was jailed at that time for financial issues, but a liberal candidate, a defender of freedom, and on the other hand, a quiet professor without a program or political party. The fact is that on one hand, we had a candidate that was able to communicate. The candidate who was in jail had, to be honest, a headquarters that was always open to journalists. It was possible to meet members of his team. There was several press conferences and press releases, and the communication was there. While the second candidate, who will become the president ruling today, was elusive and continued to be so today. This highlights for me in a strong way how accountability is again left out in Tunisia. In 2019, I tried to pursue two topics for the media coverage: the online campaign and the strong use of social networks with the question of the mass manipulation. But this time I found myself facing a lack of accountability from abroad. The EU observers were monitoring Facebook and the supporter group of the candidates. I tried several times to get an interview with the person in charge of this monitoring without success. Even though this campaign on social network has had an impact on the electoral process, as we have seen in other countries, I then wondered about the posture of those observers. If such an observation had taken place in France from an international organization, could these observers have remained silent in front of requests from national journalists? I'm not sure. The second topic that I tried to pursue in 2019 was to cover the vote of the youth and try to understand the evolution of this social category between 2011 and 2019. But due to the lack of data collected by the different organizations, this coverage could not be done. But at least in 2019, we could finally focus on candidates, on political parties, on programs, because info, data, knowledge had been collected, accumulated, because a memory was built. Even if the role of the media is not always accepted, and the authorities may prefer us to remain silent, rather than seeing us playing our role as a counterpower and conduct of information to the citizen. That was my own experience. And I would like now to hand over to my colleague Lilia Blaise. She will tell you also about her own difficulties in trying to get the authorities to talk to her, the lack of accountability, and she will take some different examples about the elections, but also about her relationship with the police on the ground.
Hello, thank you so much, Sana. So I will not introduce myself since Sana did it earlier. I will go straight to the point on two examples of issues I have been working on for some time as a journalist, and which illustrate, I think, the difficulties we can have as journalists covering Tunisia. I will start with the victims of terrorism activity in the region of Kasserine, which is in the west center of Tunisia. And also I will talk about the aftermath of the election of 2019 and the context after Kais Saied seized power on the 25th of July, 2021. So to start, I think the general idea was to talk about accountability. And I think the relationship as journalists we have with the police and the security forces in Tunisia is a good example. Because as a TV journalist, I always need an authorization to be able to film somewhere, which is already something that can be that can prevent me from working well, because the authorities have to give me the authorization. So there is always a lot of paperwork to fill. Sometimes the police ask many questions about the subject we are working on, especially when we are outside of Tunis. With my colleague, for instance, they can follow us for security, as they say, but it can be intimidating for the people we interview. So I would say that's one of the first difficulty. And then I did an extensive TV report on the collateral victims of terrorism activities in Kasserine. In the small mountains of the border, there has been terrorist activities since 2013, leading to confrontation between the military and jihadists. The jihadists put mines in the ground, landmines, to trap the military, and it's very frequent that shepherds or farmers living nearby walk accidentally on them and get killed or severely wounded. So it's very difficult for the populations living there. They feel abandoned, and sometimes they're also the victim of blackmailing by the jihadists to give food or intel on the police, and they can't really act on it because when some of them went to the police to denounce those kind of action, the consequences were tragic. I went to see families of farmers who got beheaded by the terrorists. And I also went to see families whose children had accidentally walked on a mine and got killed. So this affects the economy of this region because most of the people are living from the mountains, especially for their sheep, which use the mountains as pasture lands, but also they are getting plants and other food from the mountains. So this is to give you a bit of context. I have been covering this issue for the past few years, and one of the main difficulties, besides what I told about the logistical issue with the police, is that you don't have any accountability of the security forces on this specific matter or any communication. It's very difficult to access any data on how many victims of civilians there has been since this terrorist activity started. And it's also very difficult to communicate with the security forces about how they are protecting the population or trying to find a solution for the people living in the mountains. The Ministry of Interior there is a complete blackout, and they never answer email or fax because we still have to send sometimes fax to the Ministry of Interior to get an interview. So we end up as journalists with only press releases from the security forces that just mentioned that someone died in those regions without giving any details. When you do such report, you want to know how many people died over the years, but also you want to basically talk to the authorities. And as I said, it's very difficult. I had literally to compile every press clips on my own I found on the issue to get a sense of what was happening. So I think that's kind of one of the difficulties, and it's also it's also one of the examples of the lack of accountability of the authorities on specific issues such as terrorism. The other story I wanted to talk to you about, to pick up on what Sana said earlier, is also linked to the issue of how people, and mostly authorities, perceive the journalists. I think there has been, since the revolution, a change in the way journalists are doing their jobs, because they have more freedom and there is freedom of expression as well. But the authorities don't have a perception of journalists as information providers. They still see journalists as receivers for press releases, and they expect journalists to just publish the press release as it is stated. They are not used to being questioned, or to journalists doing deep, extensive reports on issues that we need accurate and precise data. They are also not used to being questioned by journalists. I faced similar challenges when I was covering the 2019 elections as Sana. So one candidate was in jail most of the presidential campaign, while the other candidate for the runoff was someone nobody really knew, who did his campaign under the media radar. As journalists, we were pulled between an overwhelming communication from the team of the first candidate who was in jail, because they were following a political narrative of presenting him as a victim of the political system. And on the other hand, you also need to follow the unusual campaign of Kais Saied, who was avoiding the media at all costs. So in both cases, you can see how the perception of the media is also problematic from the politicians. We are not seen as people who will cover elections, but just as tools or enemies by the politics. Of course, you could say I'm naive and that politicians don't usually like journalists, in any country, and they are used to use the media. But in Tunisia, the issue is that if there is not even a mutual understanding that we are doing our job and trying to provide basic facts and in-depth analysis, especially when the campaign took such a wrong turn and people were lacking information on what was really going on. So it all comes down to the issue of perception for me. The journalists are not perceived as journalists. They are often humiliated or targeted by politicians for not taking sides. And it's still very common now. I was myself the target of verbal and social media attacks after Kais Saied took power. This is my last example, how I covered the 25th of July. So it was a specific context because, as you may know, Kais Saied took power after 10 years of delusion from the people in politics. There was a lot of conflicts in the parliament. Politics were not agreeing between each other. And all this was really very public because the national TV was live streaming every plenary session of the parliament. So everyone could see how the parliament was a complete mess. And it reached a peak when Kais Saied took power on the 25th of July and decided to freeze the parliament. Many Tunisians were happy because this action came after years of political disappointment, as I said, and because there were many conflicts in the parliament. So very quickly, as journalists, we were trying to grasp what was happening because Kais Saied sort of relied on the constitution to freeze the parliament and dismiss the prime minister, but at the same time, he took a lot of freedoms from the constitutional text. And so as media, we had to sort of relate all of that. And the foreign media was very quickly accused to take sides and not admit that Kais Saied was doing what the population wanted. It is true that, for instance, in some media, especially American media, they were quick to compare the situation with the military coup in Egypt, and that was not always accurate. But I think it's also because, it was so unusual to have this kind of situation in Tunisia that everyone was trying to sort of placate some analysis on the situation. For myself, I would say that we were in a legal limbo, and even jurists did not agree on how to qualify the situation we were living in. So as a journalist, we had to sort of cover daily news, but also take some distance, to give good reports. And very quickly, we were targeted because there was a bipolarization settled between the pro-Kais Saied and the anti-Kais Saied. And there was no room for a balanced position, which is supposed to be our job as journalists. So 8 months, so I would say it was very difficult because we were not able to cover in a good way what was happening. We were always confronted with upsetting popular opinion, and especially because as foreign media, we are more watched than other media, because in Tunisia, some people always think that foreign media are giving an inaccurate report of the situation of the country, or are trying to give a bad image of the country. It's very common. And there is also the plot theory, which is also very common. So every information coming from foreign media is taken a bit too seriously, and also in a wrong way by some people. 8 months after the coup, things calmed down, and since more opponents or pundits have also criticized Kais Saied, people tend to accept a wider range of opinions, but there is still strong reaction on social media when foreign media points out the violation of the constitution or the dismantlement of a institution led by Kais Saied. So I think it's really a lesson for us as journalists on how to cover the construction of democracies. The argument of people in favor of Kais Saied are, he's not doing anything wrong because what he's dismantling, the parliament, the Supreme Council of Magistrates, the Commission Against Corruption, all of them were corrupted and not making any change. And that's why Kais Saied is still popular in the polls. And we as journalists, we have also, to take this opinion seriously and to write about it. On the other hand, the monopoly of powers, the way the police is muffling the protests, the lack of countervailing power or any dialogue between the president and the rest of the political sphere, or even with the unions, are very worrying and indicators that the democracy is on a precarious path. So as a journalist, you really have to basically cover both sides of the story. And I would say it's really a challenge, especially also to avoid placketing any preconceived idea on what a democracy should be, or taking the example of the Western democracies, which are not the same that, what is happening in Tunisia. We must remember that it's still a very new democracy, and Tunisia is also finding its path, trying different political models. What I can say to conclude is that despite all of these difficulties and this particular context we are still in, we are still somewhat able to do our jobs as journalists. Freedom of expression is still there. But I would say that it's kind of very difficult because we have to fact check even more all the information. We have to work twice more when we are doing interviews to compensate the gap or the lack of data, and of the lack also of studies on some issues. So it's definitely more work than in other countries where you have better channels of communication or better access to authorities, but it's also a great learning experience.
Thank you, Lilia. That was super interesting. I just would like to talk a bit about hope. So the question here is the accountability and the media coverage, and how can media try to do their job in Tunisia? Before 2011, it was really difficult because there was no accountability and no will for accountability. After 2011, there was an attempt for accountability. But now And there was hope that maybe freedom of press will have a bigger space. But now we end up feeling that the president is trying to go backwards. Is there still hope for media coverage in Tunisia and for accountability? Maybe I will begin to ask you, Mr. Jendoubi, your point of view on what happened and if we can still make progress or if we are stuck.
Est-ce qu'on progresse, on recule ou on stagne? Voilà,
et quoi faire voilà, de la redevabilité depuis 2011 et du travail des médias?
C'est très intéressant vos deux exposés et je pense que ça me permet, moi, de voir un peu comment des journalistes voient la situation. C'est différent, hein, ça c'est clair. Il y a un point de vue différent et c'est éclairant sur la manière dont on traite les éléments d'information. Tout d'abord, petite remarque, enfin quelques remarques préliminaires. Les médias en Tunisie, c'est une illusion. On a, pour moi, les médias en Tunisie, ce n'est pas le produit de la révolution. Les médias en Tunisie, pour l'essentiel, c'est ce qui existait avant la révolution, avant 2011. En gros, la situation a changé un petit peu ainsi. Avant, ça a été contrôlé totalement par le pouvoir. Après 2011, ce sont des lobbies, des partis politiques et des corrompus qui contrôlent les médias, les principaux médias. Et les médias publics se battent, les journalistes dans les médias publics se battent depuis 2011 pour essayer de se libérer de cette emprise de l'État. Et malgré leur combat, il y a eu quand même plusieurs grèves qui ont eu lieu en Tunisie en 2011, 2012, etc. Notamment quand il s'agit de nommer les responsables éditoriaux, les responsables de ces médias-là. Il y a eu pas mal de réactions. Cependant, la situation n'a pas changé. Elle est restée exactement la même qu'avant la révolution. Donc, l'idée de dire les médias sont les produits de la révolution n'était pas une bonne idée, c'est une fausse idée. Il y a eu quelques initiatives qui ont été créées par des jeunes journalistes, par des blogs, etc., qui sont très intéressants, mais ce n'est pas les médias en Tunisie. L'impact des médias en Tunisie, c'est les grosses machines, télévision, radio, qui sont la propriété de cette alliance, si je peux m'exprimer ainsi, entre des lobbyistes et des partis politiques. Donc, c'est ça aussi qui crée une espèce de suspicion, hein, donc à l'égard peut-être des médias et peut-être des journalistes. Et pourtant, ces journalistes mènent un combat absolument remarquable. D'ailleurs, une grève générale va être organisée bientôt par le syndicat national des journalistes, hein, pour protester contre toutes les paracasseries possibles et imaginables qui existent. Plus encore, on recule parce que en 2011, et cette année est une année historique en Tunisie, ce n'est pas simplement parce qu'il y a eu les élections, mais parce qu'il y a eu l'adoption de 4 ou 5 lois fondamentales. La première loi, c'est un décret-loi, ça concerne la liberté d'association. La loi a libéré la constitution d'associations, toutes les associations. Les Tunisiens et les Tunisiennes peuvent créer librement les associations par un régime déclaratif. Il suffit de se réunir, de faire un statut, des statuts et d'aller informer les autorités de sa création. Bien sûr, il y a eu des tracasseries, mais c'est une liberté conquise, c'est important. La deuxième loi qui a été conquise en 2011, c'est la liberté de créer des partis politiques. Parce qu'avant 2011, les partis politiques sont autorisés. Il y a un système d'autorisation des autorités. Après 2011, et notamment, c'est un système de libre choix, et simplement déclaratif aussi, moyennant quelques conditions évidemment minimales. Il faut que les partis n'œuvrent pas soit pour la violence, il faut qu'ils croient à un certain nombre de principes démocratiques dans leur fonctionnement, il faut que leur financement soit aussi transparent, mais c'est quand même une loi très libérale, ce qui a permis de créer beaucoup de partis. En 2011, au moment des élections, il y a eu 114 partis. En fait, en réalité, beaucoup d'entre eux sont des partis que je qualifie de familiaux. Ils se présentent pour les élections, parce qu'à l'époque aussi, le financement public de la campagne électorale était très généreux. très généreux. Et donc, beaucoup de gens ont pensé créer des partis, se présenter aux élections pour capter ce financement public. Il n'était pas très, très important, mais quand même était généreux. Ça existe, hein, c'est la première fois. Ça, c'est la loi sur les partis. La troisième loi, ça concerne l'audiovisuel, qui a créé une instance de régulation, qui est la Haute Autorité indépendante de communication audiovisuelle, HAICA, et c'est en 2011 que ça a été créé. Avant, il n'y avait pas d'instance de régulation. Toutes ces lois-là risquent d'être remises en cause depuis le coup du 25 juillet. Je dis risque, non pas encore, mais il y a des messages qui sont clairs, hein, de la part de M. Kais Saïd, quand il attaque les associations en les accusant d'avoir des financements étrangers, hein, qui sont au service d'un agenda étranger, encore l'étranger. C'est encore ça, partout d'ailleurs, pas qu'en Tunisie. Moi, je vis en France, c'est la faute des étrangers qui a des difficultés. Donc, vous voyez, donc il y a des candidats qui surfent là-dessus. Donc, bon. Et puis, bon, aussi, il y a des remises en cause réelles. Il y a même un projet gouvernemental qui vise à réviser cette loi, qui est une loi vraiment libérale, qui est un acquis fondamental. Je veux dire par là qu'en gros, effectivement, il y a une espèce de détricotage de ce qu'on a progressivement, peut-être mal parfois, mais souvent quand même, fait comme acquis démocratique, soit au niveau institutionnel, soit au niveau juridique. Ce détricotage ne date pas du 25 juillet. Il existe aussi avant le 25 juillet. Ce que le 25 juillet, c'est-à-dire le coup de force que Kais Saïd a engagé contre le Parlement, parce qu'il considère que le Parlement était la menace imminente, selon l'article 80. Donc, contre ça, le coup de force, ça, en réalité, a aussi facilité ces attaques vis-à-vis de ces acquis-là. Donc, pour moi, on est en train non seulement de reculer, mais on est en train de détruire les quelques rares acquis que nous avons conquis depuis 2011. J'ajouterai un des acquis importants pour nous, Tunisiens, pendant 10 ans, c'est le droit de vote, c'est la liberté de vote. Nous avons, pendant 10 ans, voté, nous n'avons jamais autant voté de notre histoire, pendant 10 ans. Nous avons 2 présidentielles, 2 législatives, 1 municipale, etc., etc. Bon, sans parler de la constituante. C'est une tradition. En gros, nous commençons à avoir une culture de vote. Elle est peut-être pas toujours complète, elle est encore balbutiante, c'est vrai. Il y a des tas de problèmes qu'on trouve, notamment en termes de transparence, en termes de redevabilité, etc. Mais c'est quand même des acquis. Ça, c'est autre chose. Nous n'avons pas engagé des réformes. La révolution a été réalisée par des gens qui demandaient aussi, par des jeunes en particulier, mais pas que les jeunes, aussi d'autres, la dignité et la liberté. La dignité, ça veut dire le travail, c'est-à-dire les causes de la révolution sont pour l'essentiel des causes d'ordre social. Or, qu'est-ce qu'on a fait pendant ce temps? On a fait de la démocratie politique. On s'est occupé du volet politique et institutionnel et on a négligé totalement les volets économiques et sociaux.
Monsieur Jendoubi, permettez-moi de rebondir sur ce que vous, to question Lilia about what you Mr. Jendoubi, were saying, because you explained to us, and we witness it, the fact that the media is a scene that is owned by lobbies and political parties in Tunisia. That there is still a lack of trust between citizens, politicians, and journalists. Obviously, we as journalists might need to explain more our work. Maybe we need to explain more to the citizen why media coverage is an important topic. But Lilia, I would like your point of view on that situation, because it seems that it's more and more difficult to cover what's happening in Tunisia at the moment, since the coup happened. Do you have in mind some stuff that we as journalists should do to try to defend and make the battle for the press freedom?
I think it's kind of difficult because, as I said earlier, the perception is already biased. I represent a French TV channel, for instance, and so there is all the background of French colonization that comes, into mind when a Tunisian talks to me. So sometimes, I'm just perceived as the enemy and as someone who is just, here to give a misplaced opinion on the country, whereas, I'm just doing my job. There is also the issue I did not talk about earlier of the how much value the information shared on Facebook is equal and sometimes even more valued than the information from a journalist. Facebook was a great tool during the revolution for a lot of Tunisians because it enabled them to share a lot of videos or information of what was going on. And so a lot of people said, it kind of pushed the uprising. And now I would say we have also the bad side of the use of Facebook, which is that you have 7 million Tunisians who have a Facebook account on a population of 12 million inhabitants. So it's a lot. And everyone has an opinion, which is great, but everyone also think they are an expert on a subject. And so the perception of journalists is that, I, as a Facebook user, have as much info or as much right to share what I think than what a journalist is reporting on. And I think there is a misplaced idea that we are just sharing opinion as journalists, where I'm basically just reporting facts and also doing a lot of work to get those facts accurate. So when someone just, think they have the same info, but from other sources, and they think they are journalists and they share it, it creates a lot of damage because basically I have to deflect a lot of fake news on Facebook. And you have always to be confronted with people who think they are doing the same job as you, whereas they are just people sharing fake news. But I think it's also an issue in other countries. I think in the US, it's also an issue. So I would say that's one of the main problems. We are not really perceived as people who give an added value to the information. I think, as you said, Sana, we have to question ourselves as well. Me, for instance, I always try, when it's not an insult or someone targeting me personally, I always try to answer, and I always try to advocate for my work and also be transparent about how I do my work. I share on social media, every report I do, and I try to interact with readers or viewers whenever I can. And also, I think to come back on what you were saying about the freedom of expression and the risk, with what we are going through right now, I think what is important is that even if the mainstream Tunisian media are still kind of owned by a lot of political lobbies or lack financial means to do deep investigative reports, we have also a new generation of alternative and independent media who are very good at their job. For instance, today I was covering the final dissolution of the parliament, but there was also a very important trial about police impunity regarding a young man who was killed by the police. And a lot of young journalists were there covering, the trial. And I think that's also a good sign. There is a new generation regarding the issue of accountability very seriously, and also trying to do their job as journalists despite the situation we are in. So I think it goes both ways. Basically, we as media, we have maybe to change the way we're doing our job, maybe be closer to the audience and try to show them that we are not here to serve foreign interests, as I heard often, or to placate any prejudice on the country, but we are really here to try to give a better sense of what's going on. And also I think, you know, the audience and the mentalities have to change also a little bit in Tunisia, and maybe be more aware about the role of journalists.
Thank you, Lilia. I have now, I'm thinking along the discussion, and I have another small question that raised up in my mind. If we as media should think in a different way on our approach, our methodology, if we keep in mind that we've been trying to cover all the elections in the same way since 2011, but that now we are, as you said, Mr. Jendoubi, we are going backwards on the freedoms and on the laws. What should be our position regarding what is supposed to happen next? To set up the context, the elected president took over all the powers. He dissolved yesterday the parliament. He would like to write a new constitution. He would like to set up a referendum, and he would like new legislative election to take place prior to the end of the term. But that's a huge question regarding the democracy. And I'm wondering, as journalists, what should we do? And as human rights defenders, because if we consider that the president just made a coup, what should we do? Should we go for a media coverage and try to give to the citizen all the information, even if writing a new constitution might be illegal? Or should we stop our work? So I'm addressing that question to you both. Mr. Jendoubi, what should be our posture now, our position regarding the next step on the democratic process in Tunisia?
Moi, je suis plutôt que de poursuivre, d'observer, d'analyser, tout ce qui se passe en Tunisie. Je ne suis pas partisan de l'idée de boycott, hein, qu'il soit économique ou informationnel. Je pense qu'il faut, dans des conditions évidemment qui peuvent changer, mais aujourd'hui quand même, en dépit de toutes les difficultés qui sont réelles, que vous avez signalées, il y a une marge de travail qui existe et qui concerne aussi bien les journalistes nationaux que les journalistes étrangers que couvre aujourd'hui la Tunisie. Donc, il y a nécessité pour plusieurs raisons. Peut-être la principale, c'est de dire que la Tunisie, c'est le pays qui est regardé par le monde entier, je veux dire, notamment par les voisins. Ce qui se passe en Tunisie impacte beaucoup ce qui passe, les Algériens, les Marocains, les Libyens et d'autres pays de la région. Mais ça aussi impacte beaucoup aussi l'Europe, les États-Unis, le monde. C'est une expérience particulière qui a certainement, pendant un certain moment, a donné beaucoup d'espoir, mais qu'aujourd'hui a des difficultés, a des problèmes, et qui peuvent peut-être la remettre en cause, cette expérience. Mais en même temps, il faut peut-être relativiser aussi l'histoire des évolutions des pays. On n'accepte pas la démocratie du jour au lendemain. 10 ans de l'histoire d'un pays qui a vécu l'autoritarisme, le despotisme, et pour ne pas dire des siècles, ne peuvent pas se démocratiser en 10 ans. Il faut tout un travail à long terme, il faut un combat à long terme. Et probablement, ça va concerner des générations. Donc, et je crois que la génération, pas la mienne qui a vécu, mais certainement celles qui sont venues après, ont un apprentissage, des approches, une manière de faire qui est différente et qui ne vont pas céder aussi facilement à des acquis qu'ils ont conquis, hein, notamment le droit de vote. Les élections en 2019 ont vu l'arrivée massive des jeunes. Et les jeunes, pour s'inscrire d'abord, et aussi pour voter, ne sont pas venus comme ça, ils sont venus pour sanctionner. Effectivement, ils se sont inscrits pour sanctionner un système qui, à leurs yeux, et à juste titre d'ailleurs, n'a pas répondu aux attentes ni aux besoins des gens. Donc, cet outil, cette arme qu'ils ont conquise, hein, qui est le vote, il me semble qu'il n'est pas facile de leur arracher ça. Donc ça, c'est un. Et puis, les jeunes et les moins jeunes ont conquis la liberté de parler. S'il y a une conquête importante en Tunisie, c'est que les gens parlent. Parfois, ils parlent excessivement, s'expriment d'une manière désordonnée. L'expression sur Facebook aujourd'hui, effectivement, est terrible. L'impact parfois devient... Il y a la violence dans les expressions, mais ils parlent. Ils ont arraché le droit à la parole. Ils parlent pour dire des choses. Donc, ce qu'il faut, certainement, je ne sais pas ce qu'il faut, mais en tout cas, il faut qu'il puisse avoir un apprentissage pour pouvoir raisonner, dans un sens, cette parole libérée. Il y a une parole libérée en Tunisie. Et Kais Saïd ou pas, les gens la gardent. Kais Saïd, il est très critiqué sur les pages Facebook aujourd'hui. Non, il lui insultait même, ce qui est dommageable pour le niveau de... Et je lis des choses les journalistes aussi, il y a des articles qui sont publiés, y compris dans les radios, certaines radios. Certainement moins les radios publiques, c'est vrai. Moins la télévision publique, quelques radios privées. Moi aussi, parlent très librement. Très librement, ils disent ce qu'ils pensent. Et parfois, en prenant le risque d'être attaqués par les phalanges qui sont mises en place, facebookiennes, mises en place par telle ou telle force. Ces phalanges de Facebook, que j'appelle phalanges, n'ont pas été créées par les gens de SAS seulement. Les islamistes ont leur propre phalange. Les nostalgiques du régime, Ben Ali, dictature, ont leur propre phalange de Facebook. Il y a des pages Facebook qui attaquent systématiquement les journalistes, bien sûr, qui écrivent des choses qui ne leur conviennent pas, contre lesquelles ils s'injurent, mais ils attaquent aussi les hommes politiques, les femmes, les féministes, ils attaquent aussi les homosexuels, ils attaquent tout ce qui leur semble différent et pas acceptable dans ce pays. Donc, vous voyez dans quel sujet. Donc, il faudrait suivre cela. Il y a une sorte de maturité qui doit se faire. Et elle demande du temps, certes, tout en étant vigilant. Ce qui se passe, la dérive aujourd'hui de Kais Saïd, elle est très inquiétante. Et elle peut donner un coup d'arrêt mortel au processus de démocratisation en Tunisie. Pire encore, elle peut aussi préparer le terrain à une sorte de violence, de guerre civile. Parce que s'il commence aujourd'hui, comme il a déclaré, de poursuivre pénalement des députés qui se sont réunis récemment, avant-hier, d'une manière virtuelle, pour décider ce qu'ils ont décidé, à savoir la suspension de toutes les mesures d'exception qu'il a prises depuis 25 juillet à nos jours, s'il commence à exécuter cette menace, c'est-à-dire de poursuivre judiciairement et pénalement ces députés, c'est qu'on risque d'entrer dans une autre situation et qu'il est inimaginable que les gens qui vont être attaqués, qui vont être poursuivis judiciairement, ils ne vont pas se croiser les mains, puisqu'il n'y a plus de débat, il n'y a plus de dialogue, il n'y a que si vous voulez, cette violence judiciaire qui va s'abattre, policière, elle risque de provoquer d'autres violences. Et donc, on risque vraiment d'entrer dans une espèce d'impasse encore plus problématique qui pose vraiment d'énormes problèmes pour la Tunisie, d'énormes menaces pour la Tunisie.
Merci, Monsieur Jendoubi. Thank you, Mr. Jendoubi. Lilia, would you like to say a final word about what should be the posture of the media regarding what's going on in Tunisia now?
I think it basically comes down to two things I always follow, and I have been covering Tunisia for 10 years now. I think we should never underestimate Tunisia and regard it or read it as any other country in the region, because I remember in 2011, a lot of foreign media were very quick to jump to the conclusion that there would be Islamists taking power and basically preventing Tunisia from moving forward as a democracy. And there was this whole debate, especially in France, about the Islamization of the society in Tunisia. And we saw basically 10 years after that the Islamists really really lost a lot of their voters. and they're very hate. And now there is the population is really against them because of their bad management of the political and economy during 10 years. And there were also never a real majority. It was always a diverse parliament that we had. So they always had to rule with other parties. And that's one of the things I learned. You can't really read Tunisia as any other country. It's the same with the 25th of July. The military in Tunisia is not the same than in Egypt. So it was not a military coup. And I think the issue now is, as Mr. Jendoubi said, is basically we are in a legal loophole. Kais Saied is using the constitution as very freely. And since he's saying he's the only interpreter of the constitution, and also because he has been a constitutional law teacher, it's very difficult because we have to sort of try to understand what he's doing. Of course, from an objective perspective, there are a lot of red flags, and we can see that the country is heading towards a wrong path. But at the same time, as Mr. Jendoubi said, people are still talking, criticizing, debating, even if there is, I would say, a general exhaustion about politics. People are still, very aware of their rights, and I don't think we can just, jump to the conclusion that Tunisia is going to become a new dictatorship. I think also as journalists, we have to be vigilant on how the population is reacting to all this, because unfortunately, the popular opinion is, as I said, very tired by 10 years of political disappointment. And I think that's where Tunisia is at a turning point, is that you can see that every protest is very, very muffled by the police. You have a comeback of the security apparatus in Tunisia, which used to be very strong under Ben Ali. So that can be worrying, and that can also participate to basically silence a lot of opposition. And there is also the economy situation, the situation of the economy, which is now the main concern for a lot of Tunisians, more than politics or more than what Kais Saied is doing. For instance, when he dissolved the parliament yesterday, nobody really cared in the population. They are just focused on Ramadan, the holy months, and how they are going to be confronted with the inflation, the prices that are rising, and it's perfectly normal. It's not always, we cannot always ask people to be interested into politics when the conditions of living in Tunisia have become very hard. So I think that's where we need to be vigilant, because as journalists and also civil society, because Kais Saied is sometimes really deviating from the law or deviating from the constitution, and it's not always something that really bother people, except for human rights defenders or people who are aware that those are red flags. So I think it's really a turning point now. And I think, we still need to cover everything. I would just, sorry, to conclude, say that the biggest difficulty of all is that our president is very silent. He doesn't communicate with the media. He just does speech on his Facebook page very late at night. So there is no press conference, there is no spokesperson. So we don't even have, as journalists, contact with the president. So it's difficult to know what he's going to do next.
Yes, there's no accountability anymore because the president is not talking with the press at all. So we're really going backward. I see that Asima is raising her hand. Would you like to ask us a question?
Yes, Sana, and thank you very much. It is very nice to know about Tunisia happenings. Actually, I coming from one of the largest democratic country like India. I come from India. Yeah, so just wanted to know that how it's like to be journalists of integrity, and what are the consequences that you faced when you don't take sides of any of the parties in Tunisia? Yeah.
So thank you for your question. I will first answer briefly. Thank you. In Tunisia, I feel that for the last 10 years, we didn't have choice. We were put in a position where we were taking part because, at least for me, I'm defending human rights and I will always go on that side. And even if I wasn't doing it, readers will put me in a corner and decide what I'm defending. So there was no really room to be seen as independent. I will hand over the floor to Lilia, who had to deal with I'm not sure about the words, excuse my French, the shitstorm. Backlash, thank you, on social media last few months ago. And maybe she can tell you more about how it is to be a journalist in Tunisia.
Thank you, Asima, for your question. I mean, it's kind of difficult because it's not really about taking sides anymore. It's basically whenever you are reporting something Kais Saied is doing, you will always have the fan club of Kais Saied, and as Mr. Jendoubi said, his defenders basically trolling you on social media and being very nasty. And you will have, if you report something he's doing well, you will have the whole opposition also trolling you. So it's very difficult because there is no rationality right now in Tunisia. It's really about a bipolarization. And as I said earlier, as a foreign media, you're also even more criticized because a lot of people think you have, you know, you have another motive than just giving the information. Like basically you're sent as a spy, or you're, I don't know, the representative of fresh colonialism. So it's very difficult because, I mean, for me, for myself, I'm both Tunisian and French, so I have to deal with that. You know, my mother is Tunisian, my father is French. I'm working for French media, of course, but I've also worked with Stana for Tunisian media. So I'm not taking any sides. I'm not representing any country. I'm just trying to do my job. So it's kind of difficult, to be. I mean, basically, you want to be balanced, but people don't like you to be balanced. So as Sana said, either you take a side, and of course you will get backlash from the other side.
Thank you very much. Actually, I asked this because in India also, if you don't take sides and if you remain with your integrity of your own, like there were journalists like Gauri Lankesh and all, they were being killed and some of them put in detention. So I just wanted to know, is that the same with Tunisia or something like that? Yeah.
I would say we have not come to this extreme. I would say that the more you're trying to be objective with what Kais Saied is doing, the more you're perceived as someone who is serving the official propaganda. And I think that's, and the more you're criticizing or just stating, you know, red flags about what he's doing, the more you're seen as an opponent. And it's also very dangerous as well. So I think it's very tricky right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is really overwhelming to know all this. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Asima. Thomas, it's your turn to talk.
Yeah, thank you. I found this a really, really interesting discussion, really fascinating. And I wanted to highlight two issues that you have brought up and ask for a little more reflection and elucidation on those. So one issue is the what you might call the triangle in which journalism is operating. You have three different values that can often pull in opposite directions. And you have clarified this, I thought, very well and given examples of that. The first one is balance or neutrality, that you say there are different views and I am supposed to not just sort of inject my own views, but I'm supposed to reflect the views that are extant in the political system, you know, the people on the two sides of the aisle, for example, the one party and the other, and so on. So a certain balance and neutrality is one. The second is truth. Truth is a big value for journalists. And you might say that when one person breaks the constitution, then I have to say that I can't be balanced. I can't sort of say, well, one people say that he broke it, other people say he didn't. But I have to speak out clearly and say, here, a breach of the constitution has occurred. And the third value is purpose. So you are deeply committed to your country, to Tunisia, and you want this country to be democratic. You want this country to have a great future. You want it to have a lively political discourse. And that is a third value, because you might say, so even if somebody broke the constitution, maybe that's the lesser evil. Maybe this is the kind of guy that we do want to have in power. And maybe we want him to do a few, or her to do a few dirty things, if only they can stay in power, right? I'm thinking here of Brazil and Lula, he did a few iffy things, but he was so good, you know, and he was so important for the country. And my God, Bolsonaro. So we want, as a journalist, maybe we want to overlook that. So that's where I'm coming from, this sort of triangle. And I want to connect that with another question, which is, what sort of influence do you have? It is not a politically apathetic country. It doesn't sound like there are many people in Tunisia who don't care about politics, right? It's a highly politicized, intense, passionate country. But people get their information from different sources. And you spoke about Facebook, for example. People talk to each other. People listen to the official media. They listen to the president late at night giving his soliloquies. And so do you have influence? Do you feel that you are moving the country, that people follow you? Or do you feel that you are just one voice among many and you're not really influencing what is happening in the country? Thank you.
I will say first that, thank you for the question. About the influence, I'm not sure that neither Lilia and I had a huge influence, or are having today a huge influence on the everyday life of Tunisians. We had it between 2011 and 2014, let's say, when we were working in a collective blog that had a huge impact on what was happening on the ground, and that Tunisians were following, because it was an alternative blog who was set up by Tunisians who are on exile. And people could see for the first time, they could read news about Tunisia. That at that time had an influence, and we could see it when we went on the street, when we went to the parliament, when we were trying to meet with ministers. They will always answer back to us, because that blog was important. That allows me to do a step and speak about maybe one of the most influential, I think, journalists today in Tunisia, who is a former blogger, but who is now a political anchor in a huge private radio channel, and he's talking every day at midday, and everybody is listening to him. So this guy is a former blogger, but now he's doing political chroniques. And about the balance and the truth and the purpose, I guess that we are standing on the same side. We are trying to defend human rights, and we will always take that side. I don't know if it's good or not. I'm not sure it's really being balanced, because maybe we should just speak about facts. But speaking only about facts in Tunisia is really difficult, because we are trying to go with what was the claims of the revolution: dignity, freedom, equality. And that's in that way that we are doing our work. Maybe Lilia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, the question of influence, because I think, you know, now journalists have less value in every country, and they are not always very trusted by people. I know that also in France, you know, and it's the same case in the US as well. I would say that I have been working in Tunisia for 10 years. So some people who know my name and who have been in touch with me through interviews or just reading my work kind of, I would say, follow or read what I do and basically trust the information I provide. But as I said earlier, I'm also very attacked by people who obviously don't know me or just, you know, see the French media slogan on me. And this is very difficult because everyone is anonymous. So they basically attack you. And even if you answer, you don't really know who you are answering to. I know, for instance, that France 24, the TV channel I'm working for, is really watched in Tunisia in Arabic, but also in French. So whenever I go someplace, they know the TV channel, and I know that I can make a difference because they have a good opinion of this TV channel. So it's very important for me to keep on doing TV as well as, you know, print. But the main obstacle, I would say, is the language. I'm covering Tunisia in French. So, of course, my range of influence would be only the French speaking people in Tunisia, who are, you know, mostly the elite and not the people in regions or even people. I mean, even the young generation is more English speaking than French speaking. But I'm trying to change that. I'm actually reflecting on, thinking about doing maybe the back office of my reports or showing more about how I do reports on social media to be able to reach more people, and especially maybe in Tunisian dialect. I'm thinking about it. To come back to the other issue, which is, you know, this triangle, as you perfectly described, I would say that the most difficult thing is the truth for me, because when I first covered the 25th of July, it was very clear that Kais Saied was deviating from the constitutional text, but he's very smart, and he kept on saying that this constitution has been made by the same people who are corrupted and who led the country to this political mess. And in a way, he was not wrong. You know, I covered the constitution making in 2011 until 2014. I mean, you had members of parliament who had ulterior motive, you know, to put some articles in the constitution, even if the result was a very democratic constitution and a very progressive text, there were still a lot of problems and legal loopholes that we are now paying, you know, and he was very smart. Basically, one of the things that enabled Kais Saied to take power is that there is no constitutional court. And who blocked the vote of the constitutional court, which was in the constitution? It was the parliament. They never voted for a constitutional court in 6 years. And when they decided to vote for this constitutional court 4 months before Kais Saied took power, they basically, I think Nahda, the Islamist party, sensed the danger of Kais Saied trying to move forward. So they sort of rushed into this vote. And Kais Saied, in the legal system, he has to approve the vote. And he said, no, you basically went above the deadline. And he was right. So it's very difficult because that's also the truth, you know. So there is a violation of the constitution, and the more we are, you know, going into the next step of Kais Saied, the more he violates the constitution. And at the same time, he's basically taking advantage of every loophole the constitution has to offer. And so I think that's the main issue, you know. Even jurists don't agree, you know. When you interview jurists in Tunisia, you have a lot of interpretations of what Kais Saied is doing.
Mr. Jendoubi.
Oui, je voudrais simplement faire quelques... Je réagis par rapport à quelques remarques qui ont été faites. L'influence, je pense, elle est proportionnelle aux attaques qu'on reçoit en tant que journaliste. Plus les attaques sont importantes sur Facebook, plus votre influence est importante. Et je crois qu'à partir du moment où Lilia Blaise soit attaquée sur les réseaux sociaux massivement, c'est que ça a une influence. Alors, il faut dire peut-être qu'il y a je ne sais pas si deux statuts ou deux postures. Bon, il y a les journalistes qui travaillent pour les médias étrangers, et dans les médias étrangers, la place des médias français est importante, et notamment le quotidien Le Monde, et en plus de la télévision France 24, qui a détrôné Al Jazeera, qui est l'autre chaîne télévisée qui a pendant longtemps formaté l'espace médiatique tunisien. Et donc, un article dans le quotidien Le Monde ne laisse jamais indifférent. Donc, en tout cas, alors ce n'est pas un article qui est lu par la population reculée, non, mais c'est un article qui est lu par l'élite, par les médias, par les gens au pouvoir, par l'administration. Je ne sais pas si Le Monde, je n'ai pas le chiffre du tirage ou de la distribution du quotidien, mais maintenant avec les sites, le site Le Monde et avec aussi les médias sociaux, souvent les articles du Monde en particulier, mais d'autres aussi médias français sont largement diffusés et ont une influence. Alors, deuxième observation par rapport aux les journalistes étrangers. Je crois je rappelle qu'ils risquent aussi des choses, y compris des violences policières. L'envoyé spécial du quotidien Libération a été proprement tabassé, violenté par la police, devant tout le monde, devant la télé, etc. Bon, rien à faire. Et il n'y a même pas d'excuse, parce qu'il y a une espèce d'impunité qui règne notamment vis-à-vis de la violence policière. Mais pire encore, il y a aussi des intimidations. Les journalistes étrangers sont victimes d'intimidations, notamment les attaques sur Facebook, réseaux sociaux, mais des intimidations diverses et variées qui peuvent s'exprimer notamment par des syndicats de policiers. Je précise bien syndicat, parce qu'il y a un phénomène particulier en Tunisie depuis un certain temps. Le pouvoir de M. Kais Saied, il est fondé sur deux piliers. Le premier, c'est l'armée, qui est une armée qui sert les pouvoirs en général, et le deuxième, c'est la police. Mais la police, depuis 2011, s'est organisée en syndicats. Il y a 6 ou 7 syndicats et qui font la pluie et le beau temps sur les réseaux sociaux, mais aussi, ils couvrent toutes les violences policières, y compris à l'encontre des journalistes. Alors, il y a des tas de journalistes tunisiens qui ont été violentés par la police, mais aussi vis-à-vis des juges. Combien de fois des syndicats policiers occupent un tribunal, notamment parce qu'il y a un de leurs collègues qui risque d'être condamné pour un fait qui était bien sûr illégal et pour lequel il devrait être puni légalement. Donc la violence policière à l'égard des journalistes, elle est malheureusement répandue. C'est la raison pour laquelle souvent les journalistes, je parle des journalistes tunisiens, réagissent par des mouvements de protestation, par des mouvements de grève parfois, comme c'est le cas prochainement. Et je trouve que ce plan-là, il faudrait qu'une solidarité internationale s'exprime davantage avec les journalistes, car ils travaillent dans des conditions, je dis difficiles, ce n'est pas le terme, conditions vraiment très difficiles. Ils sont courageux aussi pour beaucoup d'entre eux, pas tous, mais pour beaucoup d'entre eux sont découragés. Et troisième observation, la vérité, Thomas, en fait, en Tunisie, il n'y a pas une vérité, il y a plusieurs vérités. la vérité, ce n'est pas un truc absolu. Par exemple, la violation de la Constitution. La violation de la Constitution a été faite avant le 25 juillet. La Constitution a été violée par le Parlement qui aujourd'hui critique le président d'avoir violé, cette critique, elle est juste titre, hein, par le président. Donc nous sommes dans un espace où les violeurs de la Constitution sont partout. Et ce qui distingue le coup du 25 juillet, que moi personnellement je ne qualifie pas de coup d'État, je qualifie de coup de force, parce que coup de force, c'est un président élu, c'est qu'il a fait en fait, il a interprété la Constitution à sa faveur pour pouvoir instaurer un projet qui lui est personnel. C'est ça la question qui est posée. Donc, la question n'est même plus juridique, même parce que les juristes eux-mêmes sont très divisés, parce que la Constitution, pour une raison simple, il me semble simple, c'est que la Constitution de 2014 avait en réalité deux grands blocs. Le premier, c'est les libertés, les droits et libertés. Sur ce droit et liberté, il y avait un consensus, y compris les islamistes ont cédé sur un certain nombre de questions fondamentales, notamment, par exemple, la liberté de conscience, notamment l'égalité entre femmes et hommes. Ils ont voté la Constitution avec ces dispositifs contre lesquels ils ont toujours lutté. Ils étaient toujours opposés là-dessus. Mais ce volet droit et liberté, avec le préambule, a été consensuel. Et simplement, il y a un autre volet très important, ce sont les pouvoirs, c'est-à-dire le pouvoir exécutif, le pouvoir législatif et le pouvoir judiciaire. Et là, nous trouvons toutes les failles qui sont source de tous les problèmes que la Tunisie a connus jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a une lutte pour le pouvoir qui s'est engagée depuis 2011. Et la seule optique qui guide ces acteurs politiques, ce n'est pas la démocratisation, ce n'est pas la présidence, c'est comment accéder au pouvoir, comment faire en sorte que je puisse utiliser les failles de la Constitution pour se maintenir au pouvoir. C'est comme ça que les partis politiques, et notamment le parti islamiste, a réussi à gagner, à être au pouvoir pendant 10 ans. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle aujourd'hui, ces failles-là sont utilisées par M. Kais Saïed pour s'accaparer le pouvoir à lui seul. Donc, voyez, donc c'est une lutte pour le pouvoir, ce n'est pas une lutte pour la démocratie qui s'est engagée en Tunisie. C'est la démocratie la victime, avec toutes les conséquences possibles. Et les Tunisiens encore sont victimes parce qu'entre-temps, leurs conditions de vie se détériorent, la hausse de la vie, le coût de la vie est terrible, la misère se généralise, la pauvreté est une catastrophe, l'endettement du pays est quelque chose qui est vraiment dramatique, etc. Donc, vous voyez, c'est ça le problème qu'on a aujourd'hui. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle aujourd'hui, si on veut trouver une solution, et il faut trouver une solution, il faut penser à la sortie de la crise politique, mais il faut aussi penser à la sortie de la crise économique, de la crise sociale. Il faut penser démocratie. Mais qui pense démocratie? M. Kais Saïed, ce n'est pas un démocrate. Les islamistes ne sont pas des démocrates. Ceux qui ont gouverné le pays pendant 10 ans, pourtant élus par des élections qui, elles, on va dire, valables, ne sont pas des démocrates, c'est-à-dire n'ont pas le projet de démocratie dans leur programme. M. Kais Saïed, quand il s'est présenté, il a dit « je vais renverser le système ». Il n'a pas dit « je vais défendre la démocratie ». Il a dit « je vais renverser le système ». Il était clair, dès le départ. Il a dit « moi, la pyramide, je vais la renverser. Ce système-là, il faut absolument l'enlever ». C'était clair, net, et les gens ont voté pour lui.
Pour lui, oui.
Pour lui. Je termine, premier tour, 600 000, c'est pas beaucoup, 600 000.
Non,
600 000.
oui.
Deuxième tour, 2 700 000.
700 000.
C'est au deuxième tour qu'il a raflé la mise. Parce que M. Kais Saïed, en réalité, il présente peut-être, à mon avis, 20 à 25% de l'opinion. En général, on dit les Tunisiens le suivent, les opinions, les sondages le disent. Mais en réalité, quand on analyse finement les choses, il n'est pas aussi soutenu que ça. La preuve, il a
Pardon,
organisé…
Monsieur Jendoubi, je dois vous couper la parole parce que ça va s'arrêter en fait. Donc,
juste si tu peux le dire à ma place, la consultation nationale à laquelle qu'il avait organisé, il a dit la parole au peuple, il a organisé une consultation nationale par Internet L'objectif était que 2 millions de Tunisiens y participent sur 10 millions. Il n'y avait que 500 000
qui ont voté.
Avec tous les moyens de l'État. Tout l'État était mobilisé pour faire participer les Tunisiens. Et pourtant, il n'y avait que 500 000. Comment expliquer cela? Donc, c'est un peu les 600 000 qui lui ont voté au premier tour.
Merci, Monsieur Jendoubi. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Jendoubi. Thank you, everybody, for that speech. We should have taken like 3 hours to make sure that we could talk about how our ideas. But I'm really happy that we had that talk. Thomas, I'm gonna leave you close that first meeting.
Yes, it is my task to thank you all. This was a really, really fascinating discussion, I thought, which Tunisia is a small country, but it is a very important, very interesting country that has a great signal effect on the whole Arab world. And I think the debates that are happening here are fascinating and have, of course, very wide applications to all the other countries that are struggling to establish democracies. And I very much include the United States here. We are not a perfect democracy either. And we have a lot to learn from the democratic struggles in other countries.